Pokemon, a series that asks the question, how many more times can we sell the same game before people begin to notice? Beginning in 1996, Pokemon exploded in popularity when the games first hit the shelves in Japan, and quickly dominated the media space once the series was released worldwide. They had it all: video games, a trading card game, a TV show, toys, cereal, fast food promotions, and a musical. Truly the peak of the franchise. Pokemania was everywhere. Then it sort of faded to the background, until blowing up again when the children who grew up with the series became adults and now won't shut up about it. Like me. But Pokemon was not always looked on in the best light, and actually had a lot of detractors who called the series a fad, or even worse, condemned Pokemon for some of its less desirable aspects. Some more valid, and others...
because the message is violence.
well, let's just say not so much. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. All the controversies that Pokemon has faced over the years. One of the best quirks of anything in the media getting popular is that there's usually a scare that is blown way out of proportion by a certain group of people, mainly consisting of parents and overly religious people.
The Bible tells us that in the last days that the whole world will worship the dragon.
Usually blaming the occult as to why Southern Russia kids are all invested in a brand new subculture, because God forbid people actually try to talk to their kids about their hobbies. A similar story happened when things such as comic books, metal music, and D&D all first hit the scene. So this is nothing out of the ordinary. So when Pokemon started to get popular, it was almost immediately followed by a backlash from religious groups, claiming that the subject was full of satanic imagery and needed to be stopped. Most of these ideas cropped up in sermons that had no idea what they were actually talking about. So naturally, most parents fell for it.
Into the world of witchcraft, how to cast spells, how to use psychic.
They claimed that Pokemon are like demons, and they needed to be captured in order to obey our commands, therefore making us demon masters. It's funny how whenever people try to make things sound bad, they unintentionally make it sound way cooler than it actually is. The existence of ghost and psychic Pokemon were also used as evidence that the games promote witchcraft, which is a 2-for-1 deal. Some even try to compare getting gym badges like getting magical talisman needed to control Pokemon. There were even rumors that claimed that if you played the Pokerap backwards, one of the Pokemon theme songs at the time, you could faintly hear I Love Satan. Which is how I personally practice Satanism. Probably the biggest criticism from the religious groups was the fact that Pokemon acknowledged evolution, since it's one of the main factors in the entire series. And boy did they have a field day with this one, because if there's one thing we all know that Satan loves, it's the scientific theory of evolution. While this all may seem silly by today's standards, you gotta remember that this was a huge deal back in the day, especially since there was constant news stories of religious groups promoting the idea that Pokemon was satanic, and if you grew up in a religious household, then you were most likely subject to this as well. Storytime. Back when I was a little kid, I used to have this little Pikachu plush that I absolutely loved. I would carry him everywhere no matter what the situation was. Until one day, my parents talked to one of the more religious friends, who convinced them that my Pikachu was literally the devil himself. So they made me throw my Pikachu away. Still, I think that person's plan backfired since I now obsessively collect Pikachu plushies, so take that. He also tried to convince me that Spider-Man's hand sign was me summoning the devil, so I would do it in front of him just to spite him. Eventually, the panic wore off once the immense popularity of Pokemon began to die down, and little old me could continue to enjoy all things Pokemon and only be called a nerd. Despite religious people's best efforts, the Pokemon franchise didn't actually promote Satanism, and even the Pope had to come out and make an announcement that no, Pokemon doesn't promote the devil. It's a good thing that the Giratina, the equivalent of Pokemon Satan, wasn't in the games yet. Otherwise, we would never have heard the end of this argument. The Pokemon anime used to be one of the cornerstones of the entire series. While it's not nearly as huge as it once was, it was one of the main factors that made the franchise as popular as it is today. It's basically a huge advertisement to buy the games, but it was not always the best outlet for the series, since the show had some episodes that landed the entire series into hot water. Usually these episodes had a reason as to why they were controversial or just outright banned in the first place. So we'll start with some of the more light-hearted topics before we get into more serious ones. And what could be more light-hearted in our fantastical show than having guns pointed at kids? This episode had Ash and the gang go to the Safari Zone to capture a bunch of Tauros. So if you ever wondered how Ash caught them in the first place, here's your answer. This episode was most likely banned because of all the gun violence in this episode, even though no one actually gets shot, and I could see why a show catered towards kids didn't want to air this episode in particular, especially since it was distributed by 4Kids at the time, who were infamous for censoring anime to ridiculous extremes. Another weird episode was the beach episode, which was probably banned from airing due to its more lewd and raunchy tone. This episode was just out of place in a show like Pokemon.
This is totally embarrassing and degrading, but we need the money.
And it probably didn't help that Jessie cross-dressed in the episode in order to win a swimsuit competition, which I respect. Then there were episodes that were racially insensitive due to poor design choices, the most infamous being that of Jinx, whose original design was, well, let's just say it was bad. The episodes where Jinx has made an appearance has since been changed to be less yikes. Some fans have tried to justify Jinx's original design to a Japanese trend called Ganaguro, but I'm just glad that his original design was changed because it was so bad. Then, we have the most infamous episode, the Seizure episode. This was your standard Pokemon affair, with the very small problem of having very rapid and violent flashes of color throughout the entire episode. But the scene that everyone points to is this scene right here, where Pikachu blows up a missile, and then half the screen is then covered with these rapid flashing lights, which is honestly really hard to look at, even if you're not epileptic. This caused hundreds of kids in Japan to be hospitalized with symptoms of epilepsy, and thousands of reports of kids getting headaches after watching the episode. Due to this incident, the anime was put on a short hiatus in which they dimmed the lights of previous episodes, as well as pulling this episode from ever airing again. Also, Porygon and his evolutions were effectively banned from ever appearing on the show again, even though it was Pikachu who caused the explosion in the first place. Justice for Porygon. Side note, but this incident also holds the world record for causing the most epileptic seizures caused by a TV show, so good job there. This incident was heard around the world.
Why more than 600 children suffered from convulsions and vomiting after watching a television cartoon program.
And probably didn't help the panic here in the States. And maybe it was the cause for the urban legend of Lavender Town syndrome. Even some episodes that were taken off the air due to real life tragedies, such as this episode right here where Dynamax Tentacruel destroys a skyscraper, which was taken off the air after the 9/11 attacks. Still have no idea why the intro wasn't changed since it still contained this scene right here. Lovely. There were even episodes that are now lost media due to tragic events that happened in Japan, such as the Team Rocket vs Team Plasma special that were pulled from ever airing after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. Even certain moves were banned from ever being shown in the anime after tragic events in 2004. Despite this, the show continued to go on and has learned from ever making its mistakes again. Oh. One controversy that has always followed the franchise since its inception was the allegation that Pokemon fighting was basically animal abuse, which is one topic that I feel is the most valid at face value. The fact that you not only capture Pokemon but are encouraged to fight with them as well can come off as a bit weird, since at the end of the day, Pokemon are basically animal hybrids. This is a topic that the franchise actually acknowledges at some points, and even try to work themselves around it by stating that this isn't so much fighting as it is friendly sparring. See? Friendly sparring. Not only that, but the franchise tries to hammer the idea that you should treat Pokemon with respect and humanity, and this topic was even the main focus of one of the games. This hasn't stopped animal rights activists from having to say about it though. During the release of Pokemon Black and White 2, controversial animal rights activist PETA released a parody game called Pokemon Black and Blue, in which you play as abused Pokemon fighting against trainers that capture you in order to claim your freedom. This isn't the first time that PETA has tried doing something like this, since it has a history of mocking video games anytime an animal is somewhat evolved. And just like those games in the past, this game was quickly mocked online as it was seen as a desperate attempt to gain attention from the public with its over-the-top violence and heavy-handed messaging. They pulled this stunt again when X and Y were released with Pokemon Red, White, and Blue, which is very similar to the last game, but this time they also criticized Pokemon's collaboration with McDonald's. Again, this was pretty much the same thing as the last game, except this time also criticizing the food industry, because one message wasn't enough. These games, and all of PETA's games for that matter, were just edgy stunts to grab headlines, but since PETA hasn't exactly had the best track record with how they treat animals, the message felt quite quaint. I think most fans know that the franchise isn't actually promoting the idea of animal abuse, since the games have gotten a lot more sanitized to the point that they don't even resemble the idea of abuse.
I guarantee you these people haven't seen any of the cartoons at all. They have no concept at all.
But I feel like this idea would have been more popular if they went with the original idea of the anime, where it was a little more brutal and realistic. Or if they resembled the manga more, which... oh god. Side note, but the first Pokemon movie also had the message of Pokemon fighting being bad, but Mewtwo wipes everyone's memories at the end of that movie, so the message is then immediately ignored. Pokemon Go was kinda the new revival for this series. Pokemon was always popular, but this game made a comeback into mainstream relevance, and it's no surprise as to why. A mobile game that encouraged you to go outside and catch real Pokemon was a simple but amazing idea that I'm surprised Game Freak hasn't tried to do sooner. It was a phenomenon. Everyone was playing it when it was released in 2016. You couldn't go outside without seeing other people playing the game.
Look at this!
It was a truly special time, and I remember how cool it was that people who were normally not into Pokemon obsessed over trying to catch a Charmander or a Dragonite. But with a game that encouraged people to go outside, it came with its own downsides. You see, with a game that almost requires you to look at your phone while walking, it was a guaranteed recipe for disaster. The first injury only being recorded just hours within the game being released. People were playing the game while driving, and of people being so distracted that they forgot about their surroundings and getting injured. There were even reports of people trespassing into private property and even some players who found dead bodies while playing the game. It got so bad that the police had to start issuing out warnings to pay attention to their surroundings and to stop playing the game while driving, which should have been a no-brainer, but people really needed to catch that 207th Pidgey. Due to how the game was coded, it had Pokemon appear in a lot of unfortunate areas, such as memorials for national and historical tragedies. They were quickly removed once complaints were filed, so Pokemon no longer spawned in those areas. The game was also cause for concern when it was released worldwide. In Thailand, players were told to stay away from the polls as to not interrupt their elections, which Hillary Clinton would not approve of. Players in Vietnam were banned from entering the government offices and even called for a ban for the game. One player in Russia was even arrested for playing the game while at church, and many other countries just straight up banned the game, while other countries cited it as a security risk. Despite all this, or maybe because of all this, the game was a monumental success, but did die down a little and is no longer as big as it once was. Still, the game still has a huge dedicated audience, and did revive a lot of interest in Pokemon games from the general public. It's funny how most of the controversies in this video have not really covered the games themselves. Despite how big the fan base is, most of them have not really complained all that much about the games. Sure, there was a backlash by a subset of them stating that the newer Pokemon games were nowhere near as good as the old ones, but overall, there has never been that big of a split within the community into the release of Gen 8. You see, one of the earliest slogans from the franchise was the idea of catching them all, which encouraged every player to at least attempt to do the task, and has always been a fulfilling reward. That's it? In previous generations, you were allowed to bring your Pokemon from one game to the next. There were some limitations in certain generations, but at least Game Freak attempted to amend this by at least making some of those Pokemon be catchable in the form of remakes and spin-offs. This was until Gen 8, where it was announced that it would be the first game in the series to not have every Pokemon available to be transferred, effectively making it so certain Pokemon will no longer be available. This got a lot of the fan base, who have been playing the games for years, mad, and yes, I was one of them. However, this controversy was, in my opinion, blown way out of proportion by some, but I do think there was some valid criticisms thrown in there. The game was called lazy for its lackluster graphical fidelity, and not taking advantage of the new hardware at their disposal, since the series has always been on handhelds and this was the first game to be on consoles. It also didn't look all that different from previous games. The developers tried to excuse the lack of Pokemon being in the game in exchange for the better animations and models, which would have been fine until it was revealed that they were still using the same models from the 3DS era, which only made fans angrier. Again, these controversies were blown way out of proportion since I did see a number of fans directly attacking the developers in unfair ways, when at the end of the day, it's just a video game. Still, a lot of people vowed to boycott this game since they were unhappy with the current state of the games, so naturally, it became the highest selling game in the franchise's history. The games had slot machines and casinos, which is a bit off-putting, especially since the games were targeted at kids. They were phased out in the games in certain countries until eventually being scrapped altogether since the release of Black and White. The trading card game has had a fair share of criticisms by being compared to gambling, which is fair. During the 2020 pandemic, a new resurgence in the TCG exploded once a particular YouTuber caused it to once again explode in popularity, causing a shortage of trading cards. There were even reports of people assaulting each other over trying to get the cards, causing some retailers to ban the sale of them for a temporary time. This is a strange one. Real-life magician Uri Geller claimed that this Pokemon right here, Kadabra, was an unauthorized parody of him and sued the Pokemon Company. You see, Uri Geller was famous for his spoon-bending abilities with his psychic powers, and Kadabra was doing the same thing because he was holding spoons. Because of this lawsuits, Kadabra was not allowed to appear in the trading card game or the TV shows until 2020, when Uri Geller finally dropped the case and is now cool with it. During the promotion of one of the movies, Burger King had to do a recall of their toy Pokeball promotion, once a child accidentally suffocated while placing the Pokeball into their mouth. The parents later won the class action lawsuit against Burger King. The games, cards, and show all had accidental racist imagery which were changed before being localized to other countries. This game was largely disliked by the fans when it was announced, since many did not like the MOBA genre and the fact that the games were being developed by Tencent, a company that prioritizes monetization above all else. And that was the majority of the controversies that Pokemon has endured through its history. Despite it all, Pokemon continued to endure through the generations, only becoming more and more popular, and has definitely left an impact. It definitely survived being a fad, and has continued to inspire millions of fans around the world. With the upcoming release of Gen 9, the franchise is only growing stronger and stronger, and me and my Million Pikachu army will continue to unquestionably support the franchise, no matter how annoyed I get at them. Looking at you, Brilliant Diamond and Shiny Pearl.